Right. Welcome everyone to the opening interdisciplinary seminar for the fall semester. I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Ryan Masters from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Ryan is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology. He received his PhD at the University of Texas in 2011, and he was one of Bob Hummer's students there. As such, he has gone on to great fame and fortune. Following his PhD, he became a Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar at Columbia University, working with Bruce Link. He then joined the University of Colorado in 2013. Ryan's research focuses on long-term trends of US morbidity, chronic diseases, and mortality rates. Much of his research examines cohort-based changes in the life course mechanisms that influence health outcomes and mortality trends. Along these lines, he has research on how early life environments, educational trends, and health behaviors have changed across the US birth cohorts, and then the implications of these changes for adult health and longevity. He has particular interest in the health consequences of the obesity epidemic, with a focus on cohort changes in obesogenic environment. And also has considerable methodological expertise that he brings to this research, exploring the application of age period cohort models. Ryan has contributed to the recent research that is bubbling up on rising mortality among younger and middle-aged white Americans in particular. And with this expertise, he's actually a valuable member of a consensus study at the National Academy on high and rising mortality rates among middle-aged and younger adults. And he's going to present some data, related to this topic. Oh, it's not up there, but I fortunately have the title here. Trends in drug availability, economic distress, and drug-related mortality among US whites. So welcome, Ryan.
Thank you, Kathy, for that overly generous introduction. I also want to thank Kathy and Bob just for the invite and accommodating me for this opportunity. And also extend my thanks to all the CPC staff who are many who went to great lengths to arrange my travel and accommodations. I also want to thank the Institute of Behavioral Science and the University of Colorado Population Center for institutional and computing support. And I'd like to acknowledge Dan Simon and Andrea Tilstra, graduate students at the University of Colorado Boulder, for their help on several of the analyses underlying some of this work here. I want to first contextualize recent mortality trends among US adults by looking at an international context. Going all the way back to 1960, if we compare life expectancy trends among US white women and Black and US white men in solid Black, as well as US Black women and US Black men, relative to 16 peer countries' populations, which are indicated by the small gray lines, and their average life expectancy trends indicated by the solid red line. There are two notable takeaways here. First is a long-term sort of stagnation or deviation from peer countries' trends, dating all the way back to about 1978, 1980s or so. You see sort of that the slope increase among both US men and women have been lagging that has been experienced in other populations among our peer countries. This is evident for both men and women, whites and Blacks, a bit more prevalent among the US female life expectancy than among US male life expectancy. The second thing is a more recent trend, which is sort of the actual flattening among US female life expectancy, or the actual reversals in US life expectancy among men. Similar trends since about 2010, a bit more pronounced among the US male life expectancy than the US female life expectancy. If we look down a bit more detailed about these underlying trends, and I'm only going to look at US white women just for considerations of time and such, and try to look at what are the age contributions to these differences in the trends. By using Arriaga decomposition, we can also see two new sort of trends underlying those bigger trends that we've just seen in the previous slide. So what is shown here is 1970 and all the way up to 2016, the age contributions from deaths to the life expectancy differences between US white women and women in peer countries. And so anything that's on a positive value, that is contributing an advantage in life expectancy for US white women compared to peer countries. Anything that's at a negative value is contributing a life expectancy disadvantage. So in 1970, US white women, or the life expectancy among US females was actually 1.3 years greater than in peer countries, driven overwhelmingly by advantaged survival in infancy and childhood, as well as advantaged survival in older ages. It's worth noting that with all the recent attention on midlife mortality in the United States, there has always been a disadvantage dating all the way back to the 1970s or so among US female life expectancy relative to peer countries. What's notable about this then is as we watch what happens from 1970 down to 2016, in which US women now have a 3-year disadvantage compared to peer countries, is first, there has been a general loss of life expectancy at increasingly older ages. So with the attention on midlife mortality, I think it shouldn't go unnoticed that the greatest actual contribution to increasing gap in the life expectancy between US women and US men in peer countries has been at older ages. We have a chronic disease problem in this country that is manifesting in higher rates of mortality relative to our peers that is increasingly happening at older and older ages. But relative to the conversation today has been a much more recent trend that was underlying that stalling or reversal in life expectancy in absolute terms since about the late 1990s to 2016. We see this gap in the contribution to deaths between ages 20 to 64 really accelerating the widening of the life expectancy gap between US white women and our peer countries. Now, one of the biggest sort of explanations for this midlife mortality reversal among especially the white population in the United States has been what everybody probably knows of as diseases or deaths of despair. This is taken from Case and Deaton's Brookings paper in 2017. What it is showing is age-specific death rates for specific cohorts born 1975 all the way back to 1935. They are the rates of mortality from deaths due to drug use, alcohol use, or intentional self-harm, suicides. And what we can see is that for each cohort at every subsequent age, there's an amplification of this mortality risk from these three causes of death. Basic theme for today's talk is to sort of look at the individual sort of centralized assumptions underlying this deaths of despair perspective and sort of explore the extent to which this perspective sort of explains the recent midlife mortality trends among US white men and women. So if we look first, underlying this explanation is that it's very much a cohort-based phenomenon. You'll see this with a couple quotes that I use when talking about the trends and then the suspected causes for these trends. So primarily a cohort-based phenomena. Secondly, that we are justified in pooling deaths from alcohol use, drug use, and suicides because they're reflections of the same underlying epidemic, that the trends are more or less the same, and so we can analyze them as a single outcome. And then thirdly, the underlying causes for this epidemic, for the most part, has been sort of allusions to rising economic distress, unmet expectations, and then sort of psychosocial risk factors that manifest as individual level behaviors in response to these rising distress. It's motivated a number of analyses in mortality research that have encouraged people to pool together these causes of death in terms of diseases or despair, or even motivate some analyses in terms of unintentional injuries, accidents, mental health abuse, poisonings in general, or again, deaths of despair. This narrative really sort of took off in a media kind of attention back in 2016, 2017. And Angus Deaton himself in an interview with the Washington Post that ran a really big series on sort of what these deaths look like, sort of on the ground level, what What did the lives look like for people struggling from addiction, from alcohol abuse, from economic distress? Within the Washington Post, Deaton said, quote, "It's a loss of hope, a loss of expectations of progress from one generation to the next." And so within this sort of massive media attention, you also saw kind of a political bend as well around the 2016 election. John Cassidy in the New Yorker said that there's a narrative of disappointment and alienation in white America. Paul Krugman in the New York Times was lamenting the self-destructive behaviors among US whites, and publications by Hochschild and Vance was very much sort of highlighting that the cultural toolkit among poor whites was ill-suited for modern life, that their adherence to faith, to constancy, to hard work sort of made them ill-equipped for modernity. And their frustrations with the fact that these virtues were no longer paying off was leading much to sort of these manifestations of despair. It wasn't only the media that really took light of this, but there's been very great influence on the actual academic work of investigations into what's going on in the health of white America as well. In 2017, the American Journal of Public Health published a special issue with a focus on rural health. Irwin was the special editor, with the phrase "Despair in America Heartland." One of the publications within that was by Stein et al., coining that there was an epidemic of despair among white Americans. They said, quote, "Stress and hopelessness faced by this white population as they enter the labor market are met with bleaker prospects and lower paying job opportunities relative to the prior generation. They're coping with these quote unquote bleaker prospects with self-destructive behaviors," sort of again what Paul Krugman had been lamenting in the New York Times, turning to drinking, to drug use, to self-harm. Dasgupta penned in a commentary on some publications on the opioid-related mortality, saying that opioid use is providing refuge from the physical and psychological trauma, concentrated disadvantage, isolation, and hopelessness among these populations. And Deaton, again himself testifying before the Senate in 2017, said heavy drinking, overeating, social isolation, drugs, and suicide are plausible outcomes of processes that have cumulatively undermined the meaning of life for white working class people. And also along these, to quote another one from Wolf and Aaron, who were the editors of the 2013 Shorter Lives, Poorer Health Institute of Medicine report, they had said that some of the possible explanations for the trends that we're observing include the collapse of industries and the local economies they supported, the erosion of social cohesion and greater social isolation, economic hardship and distress among white workers over losing the security their parents once enjoyed. Again, seeing this cohort-based phenomenon rooted in economic distress, manifesting as these psychosocial individual risk factors that are leading people to engage in behaviors that amplify their mortality risk from drug use, alcohol use, or self-harm. I adhere to a bit of a different perspective, and one that I don't know how to exactly articulate, but I'm going to try in leaning on some existing works from some political scientists, as well as I believe he's a bioethicist at Harvard. The basic sort of alternative perspective that I'm going to highlight is one that is anchored in availability, but it's far more reflective of sort of long-term institutional and regulatory processes. Basically, it's condensed down into sort of the commercialization of medicine and the privatization of risk, individual level risk. And this harkens back all the way to Speaker Gingrich's 1994 contract with America, or probably even predating that, back through Reagan, even into the deregulatory efforts by Nixon. I would say that it's also exemplified by Gingrich's concurrent efforts to eliminate the FDA back in the mid-90s, also exemplified by President Bush's proposed ownership society that fortunately failed in those efforts in the early 2000s. But it's sort of encapsulated in Grover Norquist's dream to shrink the federal government to the size that's small enough to be drowned in a bathtub, as he put it. It's basically deregulation, the erosion of the social safety net, retreat of collective risk, and instead it's the offloading of retirement risks, medical risks, financial risks, pollution risks, risks of being shot by the police, et cetera, onto the individual. In terms of the pharmaceutical industry, Donald Light, I think, makes a really convincing argument with his risk proliferation syndrome that he advances. He says that companies now are allowed to test their own products. There's limited review times. It allows mass marketing when safety of the product is actually unknown. In most instances, we test the safety post-release. We encourage unapproved use of drugs, so a wider spread and amplification of the use to causes in which it was not approved for. And it proliferates a new disease model that lacks good evidence. So it leads to the unnecessary drugs being pushed to market with little evidence for their actual advantaged use, and patients sort of assume all the risk for this. And so what happens when institutions are granted the rights and freedom to sort of pursue reckless and predatory practices that they know are harmful to populations and fuel misinformation campaigns, such as $60 billion spent on advertising of pharmaceutical companies, with all but 4 or 5 billion of those going to physicians themselves? It likely increases the frequency and the severity of adverse side effects of pharmaceutical drugs. And so I think the opiate epidemic is a standalone phenomenon that should not be coupled with deaths of despair, but instead should be tried to be understood within a longer sort of regulatory framework of understanding this risk proliferation syndrome. And so the basic aim of this talk here is to, on the one hand, examine the central assumptions of the deaths of despair argument, that there are similar trends manifesting in the US white population in terms of alcohol-related deaths, drug-related deaths, and suicides, that it's inherently a cohort-based phenomenon, and that it's anchored in socioeconomic distress, so amplifications or concentrations of SES downturns ought to be sort of associated with trends in these. And then just for sort of a fun counterexample is to consider 2 examples in which availability was seen to exogenously change within a population and see how changing availability was associated with a change in mortality from drug use. So a look at county level mortality, cause of death files acquired, I should acknowledge NAPSIS in my work here. So these are multiple cause of death files for every year from 1990 to 2017, single year age, single year time for US white men and women aged 20 to 64. Conduct national and state level analyses for trends, and also county level analyses for how these causes of death move together. And also use county level analyses for economic indicators. And for the availability, I'll get to the explanation for why Mingo County, West Virginia is a good case to analyze. But I look at Mingo County, West Virginia versus all the rest of the counties in West Virginia to test an explanation of availability. So at the national level, I just want to highlight some work that was conducted with Dan and Andrea in 2017. This was just trying to decouple, pull apart the separate causes that constitute the deaths of despair and say, going back to 1980, how have these unfolded across time and how might they be contributing to the increase in mortality that was noted by Case and Deaton among 45 to 54-year-old white men and women. First off, it's worth noting that the increase was actually occurring only among white women exclusively. The increase among white men occurred between 1997 and 2004 and then subsequently declined. But the big takeaways here was that within this time frame, 1980 to 2013, the trends in alcohol-related deaths were actually quite stable, stagnant. In fact, they weren't any higher than trends in other extrinsic causes of death, such as infectious parasitic diseases, accidents. Suicides went up a bit, not much, except for white men, and it tracked quite strongly with the Great Recession and also the recession of 2001. And I'm kind of burying the lead here. Obviously, what we see jumping off the charts here is incredible, outstanding increases in drug-related mortality dating all the way back to the late 1990s. So the onset of the increase for drug-related mortality versus suicide-related mortality, very, very different for middle-aged white men, entirely different for middle-aged white women. And we actually see that the overall all-cause mortality trends for white men and also for white women actually track quite strongly with other extrinsic causes of death, despite these huge increases in drug-related mortality. So at the national level, we found evidence that it probably should consider drug-related mortality as something separate from these other causes. The onset at which they increase was very different. The severity of the increase, very different. The sustaining quality of it, very different as well. And it was the only cause of death that was actually similar for both white men and for white women. This also held when we expanded the age range and looked at younger ages as well, that what we see jumping off the charts here for women 25 to 34, men 25 to 34, women 35 to 44, men 35 to 44, is the shared experience of a rising drug-related mortality rate. whereas we actually see decreases in many of these other causes of death that are pooled together as deaths of despair. So it seems that drug-related mortality is something unique, standalone, that ought to be analyzed sort of on its own. If we think about the cohort base, again, this was showing cohort-based differences in the age-specific death rates of these deaths of despair. It's worth pointing out that cohort-based differences in some outcome is not actually evidence for cohort-based mechanisms generating those differences. And a way that you can actually show this is if you simulate out a data generating process that says, like, here's some age effects of some outcome. This is sort of concentration at midlife. Simulate absolutely no cohort effects and basically a linear period effect. When you combine these age patterns with these period patterns, what you actually observe across cohorts are this amplification of rising age-specific death rates, in this case, across cohorts. So the cohort-based patterns that you see in something need not actually reflect cohort effects. If, on the other hand, you simulate strong cohort effects, concentrated sort of in this baby boom generation or so, but a general trend of increasing cohort effects, all you're going to see is sort of just a shift up and down in the age-specific death rates along the ages. And of course, if you then pull them both together and have period and cohort effects, what do we see? We actually see observations in Y that are very similar to the very first data generating process. So the presence of cohort effects actually has very little influence over the observed age-specific differences across cohorts. And the reason for this, I mean, this was advanced all the way back in 1985 by Kapper et al., suggesting that if you want to explore whether or not there's cohort-based variation in an outcome, don't plot age-specific death rates across cohort, plot them across time periods, and look for discordance or non-parallelism in them. So when we do that, when we look at the data generating process that was entirely period effects, what do we see? We simply see parallel shifts, right, across the ages as we go across the periods. They're all sharing the same period effects. What do you see if it's a cohort effect? Again, what I'm plotting here, I should have mentioned this. The gray lines are simply 5-year age groups, and I'm highlighting age 30 and age 60 to simply show the discordance in the actual age-specific patterns across time periods. So here, when we actually simulated the cohort effects, we see what we ought to see if we suspect cohort-based variation. We see non-parallelism in these trends, whereas if it's exclusively period effects, we'll simply see shifts along the age lines. So what do we see in terms of drug-related mortality, for example, among white women? Ages 25 to 34, 35 to 44, 45 to 54. The individual gray lines are the specific individual year ages as well. Generally have shared sort of period-based trends that are far more similar to something that are reminiscent of period effects than they are of cohort effects. And when we buckle in, I guess, Young, or Claire, excuse me, help me out defend the use of the intrinsic estimator as fitting an age period cohort model here. We also find results that are consistent with these exploratory analyses. That when we look at the period-based variation for white men, 25 to 64, white women, 25 to 64, these are state-specific analyses. So all the gray lines are individual states. The blue line is the average for men. The orange line is the average for women. We see the national average tracking quite consistently with the period-based trends that are manifesting across all the states. There's certainly state-based variation in the periods, which is possibly reflecting of changing policies, possibly adoption of naloxone or so to possibly intervene and mitigate the health consequences of drug use, possibly exposure to fentanyl come 2013 or so. There are certainly spatial differences in the drug environment as this opiate epidemic unfolded across states and across different time periods and across different regions. But what we can definitely see is that prior to 1997, every single state on a period base had very low drug-related mortality rates. And then we saw, for the most part, states following this similar trend across periods. There's certainly some cohort dynamics going on, especially for men, but they're overwhelmingly dwarfed by the period-based forces here. So at the national and state levels, we saw no association with deaths of despair in the onset of the increase and the rate of the increase and the consistency across ages and genders. We only observed a pattern shared between men and women and of all ages in drug-related mortality. And there's evidence that it's overwhelmingly a period-based phenomenon. received some pushback that we need to investigate further down to the county level, that we could possibly pool these things together because they cluster together, not possibly at the state level or the national level, but within certain pockets of geography. Well, if we investigate the overall increase or decrease, so just the general trend between alcohol-related mortality, suicide-related mortality, and drug-related mortality at the county level, this is just for white men. What we see first off in the bivariate correlations between the changes is that they're not associated with one another whatsoever. This is a three-way scatter plot that basically shows the change in a county's drug-related mortality, suicide-related mortality, and alcohol-related mortality. And what we see is no association whatsoever here. This is the same scatter plot from three different perspectives. We're just sort of rotating around it to see whether or not there's any quadrant, especially among high suicide, high alcohol, high drug, where these things are concentrated. And they're not. It's simply randomness here, right? So even at the county level, these separate causes of death that constitute the so-called deaths of despair do not hang together, suggesting evidence that for analytical purposes, we probably should not be pooling them into a single outcome. We find further evidence for this if we fit separate stratified fixed effects analyses that have fixed effects counties, fixed effects 2-year time periods among white women, 20 to 35, 35 to 50, 50 to 65, and then also those same age ranges for white men. A standard deviation increase in the death rates for alcohol or a standard deviation increase death rates for suicide found to be non-significantly associated with any change in the death rates from drug-related mortality. And substantively speaking, these are basically non-existent, tiny. It's also worth noting, I think, there's been quite a lot of push in the narrative around the deaths of despair that these drug causes, or excuse me, deaths caused by drug use are spatially concentrated in certain areas. That's absolutely true in Appalachia, but for the nation as a whole, if you look at the row which tells us the proportion of the variation in drug-related mortality that exists between between counties instead of across time, it's quite minimal. It ranges from about 0.10 to 0.20 or so, which means conversely that about 80 to 90% of the variation in drug-related mortality rates among US whites exists actually within counties across time, that this is sort of a shared national phenomenon. As opposed to if you run these same models for all-cause mortality. Anybody want to guess the rows for all-cause mortality, which indicate the proportion of the variation that exists between counties rather than across time?
Is it about 80%?
Not quite 50 to 70%. So we do know that mortality is very much concentrated spatially in the United States. It's just that the concentration of mortality by drug use is not nearly as concentrated as all-cause mortality is. So just a quick check-in, trends in drug-related mortality rates among US white population, overwhelmingly, probably a period-based phenomenon, likely to be independent of trends in these other deaths of despair, not overly spatially concentrated, especially relative to other types of deaths. Are they associated with indicators of economic distress? I'm not the first to ask this question by no means. There have been a lot of people who have actually investigated this. Alan Kruger, unfortunately, we lost him this past year. He did some phenomenal work looking at the reciprocal nature of the toll that drug addiction takes on local economies, sort of labor force, and then the labor force being out of work, sort of fueling despair. And so there is possibly some concomitant kind of clustering of these with despair, but what came first is difficult to unpack. Christopher Room has done some wonderful work looking at medium economic changes, say within 10 or 12 years, and found that less than 10% of the variation in drug-related mortality rates is associated with SES. So there is existing work out there, but there's been some pushback saying that this medium term is not capturing sort of these long-term generational processes that might actually be at play here. So in terms of my analyses, I take two sort of approaches to this. I want to look at long-term trends by using the USDA's ERS county typologies, in which they classify a county's having persistent poverty. So from 1993, 2003, 2013, dating back to 1980, they say, have they been sort of suffering sustained persistent poverty? So rather than looking at year-to-year fluctuations, let's just look at a subset of counties that have endured sort of hard times. Likewise with child poverty, and then likewise with sustained population loss, looking all the way back to 1970, have these counties sort of been losing their population from outflows of migration. So they're better indicators of sort of the static nature that some counties might have of just enduring poor SES indicators. On a more year-to-year basis, I look at annual indicators from the small area income and poverty estimates in the Bureau of Labor Statistics to come up with median household income, weekly wages, unemployment rate, fluctuations in poverty rate, change in population, educational composition as well. Because these annual indicators are strongly correlated with one another, especially in certain time periods, what I do is estimate principal components and arrive at 4 components that account for about 80% of the variation in these SES indicators. The first principal component strongly tracks with indicators of like absolute deprivation or poverty, which is about 30% of the variation. A second component that kind of captures income and wealth and very highly educated populations. The third component is kind of private industry, almost manufacturing based or blue collar, about 15% or 14%. And then this fourth component is sort of like a white collar, government, high education, university towns kind of really track strongly with this fourth PC. In order to look at sort of some example counties that sort of map on to these in decent ways, I look at Claremont County, Ohio, which has been devastated by the opioid epidemic and has also been historically a manufacturing-based economy that has sort of fallen on hard times. Santa Clara, California, so Silicon Valley, DC, and then Clark, Nevada, which was a victim of the housing crisis. And so for the absolute poverty, you can see sort of starting with around the housing crisis, financial crisis, subsequent Great Recession, and the sluggish or lack of recovery in certain areas, such as Claremont, you see that most of these bump up with the economic recession in '01, and of course with the Great Recession as well. And it also illustrates sort of the between county variation that's existing across time. So it does well to sort of capture the year-to-year fluctuations within the counties, but also captures the between counties as well. General wealth being builded across time, but preserving or even widening the disparities across these counties. Private industry, you see DC just, it's 4 standard deviations outside the distribution. Claremont really taking that hit during the Great Recession. And then of course the information-based or government-based, you see Santa Clara and DC really out there 2 to 5 standard deviations beyond what the average is, whereas you see the investment in Claremont, Ohio, just sort of tracking down. So what I then use is, again, these long-term indicators, which is just a set of counties versus a set of all these other counties not enduring these long-term indicators. And then I look at these year-to-year, 2-year to 2-year fluctuations in these principal components. With the long-term economic distress, this is among white men, older ages 50 to 64, but it's a consistent pattern across all age groups and also for white women. We see contrasted to those counties that are enduring persistent poverty, the increases and the pace and the trends of these drug-related mortalities is quite consistent among all the other counties that are not subjected to this persistent poverty. The gray bars are basically the 95% confidence intervals for the persistent poverty sample. Likewise, with those counties that have been suffering long-term population loss, basically no difference between the increases in the drug-related mortality. So it is not concentrated among these subset of counties that are enduring sort of these longer-term indicators of economic distress. And then if we look at what is the actual sort of year-to-year fluctuation, what happens with a 1 standard deviation decrease in poverty, or a 1 standard deviation increase in poverty, or a 2 standard deviation increase in wealth or so. What we ought to see is that this line is going up, so that with the standard deviation increase in poverty, we should see drug-related mortality going up. With the loss of wealth, we should see drug-related mortality going up. Likewise, with the loss of industry or loss of government, we should also see it going up as well. What we find is that there's really no significant association from the sort of year-to-year fluctuations in drug-related mortality. So they don't seem to be responding within a small economic time window through these economic downturns. And just to put it in relative perspective, again, here are the estimated fixed effects for the time periods for the 20 to 35-year-olds 35 to 50-year-olds, and 50 to 65-year-olds. These general trends, again, starting around the late 1990s, basically moving independently of the year-to-year fluctuations in these other economic indicators. In terms of then considering availability-based explanations, it's quite difficult because, availability, at least for opioid-based painkillers, that might have been sort of the original spark that kind of kicked off the whole opioid epidemic, really started back in the mid-1990s, late 1990s or so. But data collection efforts on prescribing patterns really didn't sort of originate until about 2006 or so, when states really became interested in implementing these prescription drug monitoring programs. And so they really wanted to see and track and curtail prescribing patterns. So it's really hard to find good evidence because we miss sort of 10 years of that window. What I try to do is ID changes in the outcomes that would have suggested sort of causal effects of changes in availability. So what I look at first are changes in suicide rates among white women from poisonings versus non-poisonings, because upwards of about 40% of suicides are among white women are due to ingesting some form of poisonings or another. Whereas among white men, I believe it's only around 8 or 9% or so. Secondly, I look at then an exogenous increase in opioid-based painkiller availability, and that's that Mingo County example that I was referencing earlier. If we look at suicide rates among US white women from 1990 all the way up to 2017, and I disaggregated into deaths from poisoning-related suicides versus non-poisoning-related suicides, what we see are two interesting trends. Both of them I would suspect to be period-based. Among non-poisoning related suicides, we see that basically just sort of a stable, flat trend. Bit of a downturn, a little bit of an upturn, maybe with the 2011 recession, but for the most part, you see it's basically flat. With the onset again of the housing crisis, financial crisis, subsequent Great Recession, we see a period-based, or I'd suspect to be a period-based increase in suicide from non-poisonings. Among poisoning-related mortality, however, flat until about 1996, 1997, when OPR availability started to change the composition of the types of lethal concoctions that women were ingesting in order to induce self-harm. Prior to the availability of OPRs, attempts were mostly driven by sleeping pills mixed with alcohol or so. With the not only availability of painkillers, but also the rising availability of benzos, that is far more lethal of a concoction for ingesting poisons. And so you see after the advent of sort of a change in the drug environment, you sort of see this rising death rate from poisoning-related suicides. And when you put them together, it appears to be sort of a steady rise since the early 2000s, but when you decouple it, you actually see that there's possibly two processes underlying the general trends here, both of which reflect two separate period-based phenomena. Finally, then, looking at the second availability test, starting in 2006, Mingo County, West Virginia, was unfortunately subjected to what has been referred to by US Congress as a pill dump. This county of about 27,000 people absorbed over 20 million hydrocodone and oxycodone pills within a short time window between 2006 and 2015. When you look at the characteristics of Mingo with the average characteristics of other West Virginia counties between this time of around 2006 to 2010, there are no noticeable differences between them in terms of underlying indicators of despair. Suicide rate is actually lower in Mingo County. Prescription drug abuse was lower in Mingo County. Psychological distress indicators was comparable. So nothing really changed in terms of the demand for these pills, but simply this exogenous shift of all of a sudden this abundant opportunity to actually have OPRs flood your population, characterized, I think, quite nicely in this graph between Tug Valley and Hurley Drug Company, shows that really concentrated between, say, 2007 and 2009, you just saw upwards of 15 million, 20 million hydrocodone, oxycodone pills sort of dumped literally into this single county. In order to then satisfy that this is in fact a causal mechanism for drug-related death rates, these shipments actually need to get in the hands of the population. So do we actually see a corresponding rise in the prescription habits within this county? Absolutely we do. In US average was quite flat across this time. West Virginia, significantly higher, but within Mingo County, specifically, again, within 07 to sort of that 2010 range, you really just saw this astronomical peak of prescription rates just sort of jump off the board here. So compared to West Virginia, Mingo County sort of had this exogenous surge of OPR availability concentrated within this narrow time frame. So what I estimate is simply the expected drug-related death rate among white men and women across 3 time periods, right? So prior to Oxycodone becoming available in 1997, and then after the onset of this pill dump. And then I fit 3 separate slopes across these 3 time periods. What's happening prior to Oxycodone should be low and flat. What happens with Oxycodone, it should start to go up. And then we say, well, what is Mingo County doing in that first time period? What is Mingo County doing in that second OPR time period? Shouldn't be doing anything, we suspect. It's just a county among all other counties in West Virginia. We really then become concerned, what happens when that pill dump occurs in Mingo County relative to the rest of the state? And what's happening to Mingo within the Oxy time period, but really what's happening to Mingo County within that pill dump time period. White men on the left, white women on the right. It's a little cleaner and easier to see, but it's basically the same story between the 2 of them. Mingo County is the solid line. The rest of West Virginia is the dashed line. Sure enough, prior to OPR availability increasing with the FDA approval of Oxycodone, more or less the same, low, flat. OPR availability, they both rise at the same time. What happens with the pill dump? You see this immediate elevation in mortality risk within Mingo County relative to the rest of West Virginia. And not only that, you actually see a significant amplification of the increase within Mingo County as well. The slope is significantly higher than the slope in the rest of West Virginia. And subsequent analyses that pool together West Virginia across these time periods show that they are experiencing the exact same slope across these time periods. It's only in Mingo County do we actually see this elevated mortality risk. So basic considerations then, I think, from this sort of set of analyses. Taken together, I'd say that the empirical evidence does not support the central claims of the deaths of despair perspective. In fact, it runs directly counter to it. There's no strong evidence to suggest that drug-related mortality are overly concentrated among any specific birth cohort, or that the rates are increasing across subsequent birth cohorts. Rather, the epidemic appears to be a period-based phenomenon that arose after changes in policies and practices affecting the drug environment. I'd also say that the trends in the separate causes of death that constitute the so-called deaths of despair are unrelated to one another at the national level, at the state level, and appears to be also at the county level. There's no significant or substantive associations estimated to exist from the fixed effects models or from just the general exploratory analyses. Regardless if we look across men and women at younger ages, middle ages, older ages, or all of them together. I think it really encourages us to cautiously and suspiciously interpret results that pool together analyses of mortality between men and women across multiple ages, across multiple causes of death. Again, in order to pool these causes of death together or to pool ages together, we must assume that the underlying trends are more or less the same between those causes, the same across those age groups. And then finally, I think it encourages us to rethink explanations, and especially in terms of units of analyses. The deaths of despair perspective does make vast allusions to sort of structural changes such as deindustrialization, changing family structures, resource opportunities at local economies and even national economies. But it generally invokes explanations that are psychosocial in nature and that invoke sort of behavioral responses at the individual level. I don't mean this to encourage that people have no agency in here, but I think that there are some processes operating at institutional levels that have increasingly exposed individuals to become risky to things that is outside of their own control, such as this risk proliferation syndrome. And so there's a wonderful quote by John Abramson back in 2004, an MD, when talking about sort of the FDA's framework for approving prescription drugs. He said, quote, "Something is very wrong with the system that leads patients to demand and doctors to prescribe a drug that provides no better relief and causes significantly more serious side effects than existing methods. How have we gotten to a place where expensive new drugs could become quote unquote blockbusters when there is little scientific evidence to justify their routine use?" And I would suggest that we shouldn't tolerate this as America's MO for population health. Thanks. Hi, Leah. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I have a question about your last analysis with looking at like an exogenous shock like that.
Mm.
Have you considered at all essentially replicating this at a larger scale as in identifying other places in the US that have some version of this, just to, as a kind of like, just a larger proof of concept that this applies outside of
Mingo County,
And
sure.
I'm also referencing like a question that was asked to you at the ASA session about, people questioning this on the basis of like endogeneity issues. If there's something specific about this place. Essentially, my question is, have you thought about doing something similar, but looking at the effects of a pill dump writ large, not just in Mingo County?
Sure. At the national level and the state level, at some point, 97 kind of is an exogenous change, right?
That's fair.
Oxycodone became approved in 95, Norco in 97, Percocet in 99. There's just a mass clustering of FDA approvals of opioid-based painkillers, and then very concerted, marketing efforts. Van Nee does a wonderful job in AJPH 09 of sort of reviewing sort of how this wonderful sort of PR and marketing campaign was this public health disaster. And I think if you look at the flip side of things, so what happens when drugs don't become available, but what happens when availability is curtailed? Kendricks Hennedy did some nice work looking at Florida with their closure of their pill mills between 2009 and 2011. That also coincided with the implementation of that state's prescription drug monitoring program. So very aggressive state level actions against sort of the proliferation of easy availability through these pill mills, right? And what they found is using North Carolina actually as a counterexample that didn't implement something in a somewhat neighboring state. They found upwards of over 1,000 deaths were likely saved within, a few months' time or so due to these efforts. So you can see the flip side of it as well, that what happens in certain instances when sort of availability is cut off. I want to caution that I don't just simply endorse prescription drug monitoring programs as a way to sort of, end this solution. Usually what you tended to see was that a couple of years later, those people who had been unfortunately abusing OPRs reshifted to heroin use and other illicit drugs. So usually to invoke Geronimus's recent title page is sort of whack-a-mole in a sense like that. But there are a number of instances, I think, in which you can find some different seemingly exogenous changes. To the question of whether Mingo was exogenous or not, so I would go back to just highlighting sort of what those characteristics look like in Mingo versus West Virginia, and simply ask what could have possibly changed in this county between that time that pushes back against the idea that this is what changed, and that this is what changed in response to that change, and that simply the getting into the hands of the population this vast amount of OPR painkillers was responsible for these immediate shifts and then also that sustained shift as well. It's not to discount that there might not be feedback loops or that there's a reason why that these pharmacies targeted Mingo County as a way to dump those pills in there. They probably sought out certain behaviors or certain susceptibilities to the population to actually target that. And I think that's a key distinction that probably needs to be investigated further, that the susceptibility of certain populations to the infusion of these types of practices, again, is largely outside the individual demand or behaviors, much like bodegas, liquor marts, pawn shops target certain neighborhoods. That doesn't mean that those neighborhoods were craving those services and that the sort of adverse health consequences would have been there absent the infusion of those. I think a similar argument could probably be made here. Yeah.
I actually really like this. Really, I could use synthetic control or something like that, but the white woman one looks like it's important. But I was wondering if the effects aren't even bigger. I don't know. Did any of the drugs that were prescribed and get sold to nearby counties or anything like that? Then it's an even larger effect.
Right. Yeah, that is one thing that back to Ilya's comment about ASA, that somebody raised that point. You could probably look at contiguous counties around it. There might be some diffusion. I'm not sure if it just sort of nicely diffuses out like a gas, however, because I know even in Florida that people were making trips to the pill mills from out of state. And so the actual trafficking lines probably aren't as clean as you would presume, that just neighboring counties would be the ones most likely to absorb the use of these drugs. But it would be worthwhile to probably do some boots on the ground, figure out what was happening in West Virginia at this time to try to maybe track some of the prescription habits and the diffusion. Yeah, possibly. I mean, it could almost be 3 sets in there, right? So it could be Mingo and then those counties that also sort of absorb some, and Mingo might be. That's a good point. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. There are some people who are viewing this from outside the room, and I had forgotten that their audio is only picked up through my computer. And so the question that was just asked was the exogenous effect related to the Mingo County pill dump, to consider how the sort of spillover effects of the drug availability might have landed in contiguous counties surrounding it, and investigating that possibility. Sorry about that. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. One of the things you didn't talk about in here was the changing trends by educational level, or and that's where Case and Dayton kind of originally kind of showed that these are very different across the college grads compared to the low educated groups. So I'm trying to figure out where that story fits in with yours, and I'm having a hard time with that. So help me.
Okay. I don't know. I haven't empirically investigated that. So there are 2 ways to think about it, I suppose. That the fact that there isn't that much spatial differences in this, that it appears to be a national level trend across time periods. It could be that every county's low educated population is the most susceptible, and they're sort of, dying at similar rates across time. Or it could be that there are certain counties that are a bit more concentrated in sort of economic distress or low educated areas. The latter, I think we could investigate, and it should be picked up a bit. I have done some investigations by county level educational differences, and you don't actually see that much differences. But it does beg the question that among the individual level educational attainment population, these might be manifesting entirely among that population. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Related, I wondered if you have examined race differences, which I suspected you haven't. And given your finding about the period effects, what might be the explanations for the race differences?
Yeah, the question was about race ethnic variability in the findings. Among Black men and Black women, there's an interesting cohort component here. And so I'll show you first race ethnic gender variation in drug-related deaths among younger ages. So white men are the solid line, Black men are the solid orange line, white women are the dashed blue line, Black women are the dashed orange line. There's been much attention on the fentanyl story, which onset 2013, and there you actually see the upticks among the Black population. That for the most part, there's been high and sort of steady drug-related mortality among Black men until, of course, the onset of the opioid epidemic among the white population when they outpace them. And it's only among, this recent sort of period epidemic of fentanyl now being laced among a number of drugs. But if you look at older age, so above age 50, you see a very different story. You see the general rise among all the populations with opioid-based painkillers, but you see among Black men, they're off the charts here, mimicking apparently a period-based increases here, with the availability of opioids. But the fact that it's concentrated only among the older aged Black male population and the older aged Black women population, which actually outpaced white women as well until 2006 or so. There's something uniquely different going on in the Black population that I haven't investigated to enough of extent to really say anything about, but I would speculate a couple of things. because I'll also reveal another finding is that those states that exhibit the greatest cohort-based variation in drug-related mortality are Washington, Oregon, and Pennsylvania. States that had populations that endured very large and severe heroin epidemics in the early, so prior to OPR availability. So it's possible that those states had a population having been exposed to a previous heroin epidemic were vulnerable to a new change in the drug environment. So it manifests at both period and also a cohort susceptibility. I think there might be something going on with older Black men and older Black women as well, as that their exposure, certain subsets of the Black population in America's exposure to the heroin epidemic in the 1990s made them possibly more susceptible to this change in drug environment that you don't see at the younger ages. And it's possibly also that there are differences in sort of age stratified, racialized, implicit bias of prescribing habits as well. There's been large reports of very different implicit biases in pain tolerance and prescription habits within ER rooms between Black patients and white patients. But it very much might be an age-graded sort of difference that is playing out here, that we don't might see it among the older age population, but it is maybe more common among the younger age population. Or there may be social network effects at younger ages. I don't know how there might be differences in the drugs getting into the hands of younger whites versus younger Blacks versus older Blacks and older whites. But there's an interesting different story going on there that is worth investigating. Likewise with the downtick in 06, I was speculating with Taylor earlier that this might be an interesting investigation of the state's prescription drug monitoring programs, that there could have been a racialized component of those as well, that with the implementation of wanting to curtail prescription drugs, maybe doctors were more responsive to perceive Black patients as being more likely to abuse, and so they were sort of withholding there. And so you actually see a race ethnic difference in the manifestation of the effectiveness of prescription drug monitoring programs. And then with the heroin and fentanyl epidemic, it takes off again. So there's a lot of moving pieces underlying all this stuff with very different race ethnic components to it that very much complicate things, let alone the education. Yeah.
I see sort of advances a variability argument by using the county level data. Now the DEA just released the entire country data to the Washington Post, and it's a variable, and you can do that across the entire country. But but at the same time, you sort of push back the social economic distress model by looking at the spatial correlation. Have you thought about basically bring all of them in together in a more like regression type of model? Because when you look at bivariable situation, this drug variability if there's no drug variable, you cannot die even you are in the most distressed situation. So there could be some interaction going on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I should mention that let me see here. So first off, the model here that is looking at least this availability, this guy here has got long-term persistent poverty, unemployment rates, log income, whether it's a mining county, a number of county level indicators that are socioeconomic, at least at the county level. So again, not the individual's educational attainment. Percent that has a BA, percent that is less than high school. So I do try to account for and further balance, whether or not this was an exogenous shock to the availability. Likewise with the fixed effects models that we're investigating, they also account for drug-related mortality, external causes, mortality from other external causes, suicide-related mortality. So I'm trying to simultaneously account for both despair as indicated by mortality, as well as socioeconomic indicators at the county level, as well as individual moving as well. But in terms of the availability, could you repeat how?
So Washington Post have just filed a lawsuit and get DEA to release the entire data. So it's a variable. If you search Washington Post and DEA, it's a variable. It can actually interactively search which county, what kind of variability. Yeah.
Is that from starting 06 and on?
I don't remember.
Right. Okay, that's worth looking into. Thank you.
About like 3-4 weeks ago.
Okay. Yeah, I know the lawsuits coming out of Oklahoma and others have been incredibly revealing, not only in the thought process of sort of the pharmaceutical industry leaders and such, but the information and requests have been bountiful as well. But I haven't got my hands on it yet. Thanks.
I think we're gonna have to cut it off there, but if you have further questions, please approach Brian at the end. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Amazing.